Is Asanga Valikula. I'm the director of the Edinburgh Centre for Constitutional Law. It gives me great pleasure to co-host this event together with my colleague and friend, Dr. Adem Abibi of International Idea, on this important book by an old friend again and colleague. Zaid and I have known each other for many, many years, starting working together on the Iraqi constitution a long time ago, but subsequently in many other places as well. So we're really looking forward to getting into this, what seems like a terrific book. I haven't still read most parts of it. But we will also be aided in the reading of Zaid's argument by three excellent discussants, Professor Nathan Brown of George Washington University, followed by Dr. Michelle Burgess Castalla of the University of Edinburgh, my colleague here, and finally, Professor Mohammed Fadel from the University of Toronto. And as you will know, they're all experts of the region. So I will not waste time in introducing them much further than that. But Adem, if you want to say a few words of welcome on behalf of International Idea, after that we can hand over directly to Zaid.
Thank you very much, Asanga. First, of course, we want to thank Zaid. He's not just our colleague, he's one of the stars at International Idea. We're very proud of him, and I think it's an excellent book, not just because it deals with a region that he knows really well, but also it deals with a subject that Idea grapples with all the time. So we're really grateful that Zaid can speak about that. And I also want to thank you, Asanga. We had like a strange idea, and then suddenly we could put this together. So thank you very much. And of course, our panelists, the three of them, Professor Nathan Brown, Professor Michelle Burgess, sorry, I can't really see the second part. And of course, Professor Mohammed. As Sanga said, these are not just experts, but they will also bring in unique angles to the conversation. So thank you again, and looking forward to it. Zaid?
Okay, should I start? Okay, great. So thanks first to Asanga and to Adam and to all the colleagues who are on today. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation, and thanks for all the incredible organization. I've been asked to speak for around about 20 minutes on the book. I'll try to see if I can end faster than that to give more time for the conversation. But broadly speaking, the book consists of two main parts. The first part consists of country chapters, right? So originally, when I started drafting the book, I wasn't intending for there to be an entire part with country chapters. Originally I was planning for there to be just a single chapter where I would discuss the processes that were followed in each country. But then it quickly became obvious that that wouldn't be the best approach, so it expanded into its own part as opposed to its own chapter. And there's one chapter each for Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen. And there's one chapter, like a fifth chapter, that deals with the following countries. It's Morocco, Algeria, Jordan, and Sudan. The logic behind that approach is that the four first countries, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen, were the ones that where there was the potential for huge amounts of change. I mean, in the end, in some countries, not much changed, or things didn't change in the direction that people were hoping for, and in some cases deteriorated despite the very poor starting point. But all four countries really had like this moments where everything seemed possible. In the second group of countries, meaning Morocco, Algeria, Jordan, and Sudan, the first three of those countries have a lot in common, which is Morocco, Algeria, and Jordan, which is that all three of those countries had what many people refer to as window dressing constitutional reform efforts, where a new constitution was drafted or amendments were drawn up by committees that were appointed either by a president or by a king, and those committees had very limited terms of reference and were not allowed to step over the limits of that mandate. And so the end result is something that wasn't very different to the original starting point. Sudan doesn't fit that category, or at least we don't know currently. I mean, Sudan's going through a huge moment of tension currently, and starting from around about 2 weeks ago. But up until then, Sudan really looked like it was going through this huge revolutionary moment, and it may still be. We don't know how the current period is going to end up, but Sudan was really in a category by itself, even in comparison to the other countries. And the other countries meaning Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen. And the reason why I say that is because Sudan was really the only country in the region where they had an uprising that was led by an organized political force that had a clear strategy to overturn the regime and to establish a completely new system of government and completely new constitution. Whereas in all of the other countries, the process was either spontaneous and therefore not directed, or was captured right away by heads of state, which left very, very little room for real improvements. Now, in terms of the process that I follow for each of those country chapters, so my book is obviously not the first book that offers country chapters on these different countries. There are lots of edited volumes that cover all these countries, and there's some other books like written by individual authors or couples of authors that discuss these countries. I think each of them has something different to contribute, and the contribution that I make, I think, is that I focus mainly on my own interactions and my own experiences, having lived through these experiences and through these processes firsthand, and have been in many constitutional drafting chamber, and been in many discussions with many of the constitutional negotiators and drafters, and also basing myself on all of the primary materials that are either publicly available or that are available to me, right? And the end result is that often the narrative that I offer doesn't necessarily conform with the popular conception of what happened in many of these countries. Just to give like one or two examples, is that many people still live under the belief that the Tunisian process was a really great process and was well structured and was motivated by all the right motivating factors, and I don't believe that at all. I mean, all the evidence looking at the primary material suggests that they were just very, very lucky to end up in the place that they did. I mean, there were obviously some good players, and they played a very positive impact as well, but that the same can be said in other countries too. In the end, the Tunisian process was pretty chaotic, and they were very lucky in terms of the way in which things ended up. And currently today, obviously, I mean, things have completely changed, and we can talk about that later. And another example is that people tend to think that and I know that, for example, Mohammed and I have talked about this a lot, but I feel even more strongly about this today than I did in the past when Mohammed and I previously talked about this, that some of the actors in Egypt clearly had no idea what they were doing, and on occasion were acting against their own interests in a very clear way. And it would not only would they do so, but it would take them a long time to realize it. And when they did, they would spend a lot of time trying to backpedal, causing huge amounts of pain and suffering for themselves, for the general population, including uprisings and killings and so on and so forth. So, and in my view, none of those things needed to happen. People could have satisfied all of their interests if they just had planned things out properly, or had sought better advice, and hadn't rushed in the way that they had, and so on and so forth. So maybe that's wishful thinking, but looking at the primary materials and thinking back at the conversations that I had or that I witnessed, that's some of the examples that really strike me as being very, very relevant. Now, in terms of the second part of the book, I think this is really the most interesting part of the book, or it was at least the most interesting part to write. So first of all, I mean, there's the underlying assumption with the second part, and actually the whole book, which is, and actually it's in the title of the book as well, which is that many people have described the uprisings that took place in 2011 as being a revolutionary moment. And in my view, I think that's totally mistaken, mainly because the people who were behind the uprisings were not prepared or not ready to carry out a revolution, and actually didn't have a proper conception of what a revolution might look like. So in that sense, the region was living through not a revolutionary moment, but a pre-revolutionary moment. And in my view, because of the continued existence of all of the factors that existed in 2011, all of those factors continue to exist today. The factors that led to the uprising in the first place. And sometimes on occasion, you could even argue that they're even more dramatic in some countries and even more pronounced, that it's only a matter of time for that there will be another breakdown of some type or another. And hopefully when that happens, people will be in a better place to set out a vision for what a revolutionary constitutional rearrangement might look like. And what I set out in part 2 of the book is my own vision of what that might look like. And I offer it in, not for more or less than what it is. It's only my own vision. I'm very committed to many of the principles that are set out, and I remain committed to it in the work that I do every day. I'll discuss some of those issues in a moment. So the first issue that I tackle in part 2 is the issue of the Constitution's objective. And this is a real dilemma. It's something that Nathan, in his groundbreaking book from 20 years ago, discusses in a huge amount of detail and continues to inspire a lot of us. He discusses in detail. It's something that others have talked about as well. The way in which I discuss it in chapter 6 of the book, which is the first chapter of part 2, is not what the objectives are, nor what they purport to be, what the constitutions purport their own objectives to be, but what they should be, given the crisis that we're living through, given the past 100 years of history, and given the current state of affairs for the general population further afield. And just to deal with that very briefly, what I mean by that is that the system of government as it currently exists in most countries, not all, is a system of government that looks very, very similar to what existed under the colonial period. And I know that I don't make myself a lot of friends by saying that. And that might have worked okay during a certain period of time because it depended on a corporatist system of government where people were connected to the state through corporate entities like, trade unions or the police and judges and the legal profession and so on and so forth, or the bureaucracy, the military. And that might have worked fine when the bulk of the population was connected to the state through one of those corporate entities. But it certainly doesn't work anymore when the crushing majority of the state is no longer connected to the state. The crushing majority of the population is no longer connected to the state, where 90% sometimes of people have no relationship whatsoever. They hardly even have heard of the state because populations have just grown so much and the state hasn't modernized its approach at all, other than just to rely on increased security responses to social crises. And so that system of government clearly doesn't work anymore, which is why the uprisings happened in 2011. And that continues to be accentuated today. And so what that means is that we live in a situation today where the individual is just not connected. And what the Constitution's objective should be in that type of context is to create the circumstances to allow for individual citizens or individuals who live in the countries in question to create the space and opportunities for them to thrive in their own countries, as opposed to encouraging them to emigrate, which is currently what's ongoing, or to encourage them to just live on the streets or something. So that's chapter 6. I'll try to speed up because I think I'm almost out of time, but on chapters 7 focuses on that specific issue and discusses it in more detail. It means the relationship between the individual and the state, given the crisis of our times, in this region, and given the total disconnect and marginalization of the bulk of the population, it's really the who of this question, right? Who is this for? Who is this constitution for? Previously, it was for the state. So the state wasn't a person, but people by and large understood that the state's mere existence was for the benefit of the general population. But that's no longer the case, given the current demographic and constitutional arrangements in these countries. So if now the who is the individual, which is what I believe and I argue in favor of, then we need to think about specific constitutional arrangements that can allow for constitutions to allow for the general population to thrive. And I discuss what some of those elements might be in chapter 7 of the book. And then in chapter 8, I discuss the system of government as it's existed since the colonial period and as it continues to exist in most countries in the region. I mean, virtually all countries, there might be one or two exceptions, and that system of government is a hyper-presidential system. You know, some people describe it as presidential, but I don't think that's accurate in any shape or form, because, I mean, if the US is a presidential system, then it would be crazy to define Jordan or Algeria as being presidential. I mean, the differences between those countries are just like, you know, this is monumental. And what a hyper-presidential system means, or what it looks like in these countries, is that a single individual, perhaps in consultations with others, but ultimately a single individual is deciding state policy and how it's implemented and who will implement it entirely on his own, because it's always a man, and with no meaningful accountability mechanisms, sometimes no accountability mechanisms at all. And where there are mechanisms, they're utterly meaningless. And, you know, Tunisia was a partial exception to that recently, you know, up until July. But now today, Tunisia has basically reverted back to a pre-2011 constitutional arrangement, very, very similar to what existed before 2011. The only major difference between today, Tunisia today, and prior to 2011 is that we don't have a make-believe parliament now. Now, you know, the parliament has been suspended and it's not meeting. But even before 2011, the parliament didn't play any meaningful role. So you can definitely argue that the systems of government as they exist today and as they existed before 2011 are extremely similar. And Sudan, at least, you know, the military leader who's currently orchestrating the coup against the civilian forces, is hoping to reestablish a hyper-presidential system in Sudan as well. You know, that's the jury's still out in Sudan. We'll have to wait and see how things are going to end up. But you know, what I argue in that chapter is that this system of government as it currently exists is at least a century old, possibly in some cases more than several centuries old. The fundamental building blocks of the system have not changed in any meaningful form, and that the individuals who negotiated the new texts in places like Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, and Yemen didn't really have an appreciation of where all these mechanisms came from. They just took it for granted that these are things that, you know, are just necessary. And so by and large, they didn't really play with them. There are some exceptions here and there. But if you look at Article 80 of the Tunisian constitution, which is a provision that allowed for President Kais Saied to declare a state of emergency, I mean, that provision is basically predates the 2011 constitution. It provides for these superhuman powers to the president in a way that's utterly undemocratic. And, you know, I'm sure that a lot of people who were advised to adopt a different way of doing things are now seriously regretting their decisions. And just to accelerate just a little bit more, the last two chapters in the book focus on process design and international assistance. And the only two things that I'll say about those are in relation to process design. You know, I discussed different issues, including this perennial debate about constitution or elections first. And the conclusion that I reach in the book is that that debate was always a red herring, and that regardless of what approach you adopt, both present more or less the same difficulties. And there are approaches that you can adopt in both models that can mitigate against the negative aspects of either one of those systems. But the main thing that comes across, or that came across when I was doing the writing, was really what I describe in the book as a faith-based approach in constitutional design. And what I mean by that is people engaging in incredible amounts of wishful thinking during constitutional negotiations in a way that they would never do when it came to basic policy. And I've discussed this with other friends and colleagues, and many people have said that, yeah, but that's normal because this is a political negotiation, whereas if you're drafting legislation or other forms of policy, it's not as political, et cetera, et cetera. That may be so, but I've never seen anything close to being an attempt to mitigate against that type of wishful thinking in any of the processes that I've followed. There's simply nothing even coming close to resembling a fact-based approach. You know, what I mean by that specifically is that on many occasions, you'll see, you know, the majority in the Constitutional Assembly or leading parties in the Constitutional Assembly or internationals that will adopt a specific position that have no chances of succeeding, like absolutely none. And that will clearly come back to haunt the country in question, could potentially cause civil conflict or civil war and so on and so forth. But they press ahead anyway, because they just hope that it might work out. And it seems to me that that's a very wrong approach. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. And I know for a fact that no one has ever tried to, at least in the countries where I've worked, has come close to trying to mitigate against that type of approach. And more needs to be done, definitely. You know? And the final thing is about international assistance. And you know, this is something I know a lot about because that's more or less where I find myself on in many of these processes. But basically the international assistance, and this is a very great summary form, you know, presents itself without any meaningful or easily identifiable strategy. On occasion, you know, the strategy will only formulate itself after a couple of years. And then in the meantime, it's all just a mess. And when a strategy does identify itself, it just won't make any sense for the country in question and can be very counterproductive. And that's tied to the second problem, which is the absence of oversight mechanisms for international organizations that are providing support to constitutional negotiators, where so much is left to the people who happen to be on the ground. And the people who happen to be on the ground are chosen fairly randomly on most occasions, not all, that the results can be pretty drastic, you know, pretty dramatic, and there's just no impact. You know, on the contrary, what tends to happen is that when people fail, they tend to fail upwards and tend to get promoted, which is really crazy. So I'm not arguing in favor of criminal responsibility or anything like that. I don't think that would be reasonable, but there has to be some type of oversight mechanism that would you know, force a lot of these systems and mechanisms and bodies to incorporate real lessons learned, which so far my understanding is not being done. So I'll stop there and apologize if I've spoken for too long.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Zaid, for that very crisp and concise, but nevertheless very comprehensive introduction to the whole book. And obviously the book concerns the MENA region, but particularly the last two chapters, I would have comparative relevance and resonance, I think, well beyond North Africa and the Middle East. Yes, I'm sure it will get that attention that it deserves. But without further ado, then over to Professor Nathan Brown of George Washington University for about 10 minutes, Nathan, for your remarks on the book. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for having me. In order to fit my thoughts into 10 minutes, what I'm going to do is just basically say three things. Number one, why this is an important topic, crying out for a book. Number two, why Zaid has written that book. And number three, some questions that I have even after reading the book on this experience. First, the topic itself, I mean, you know, looking back, it's clear there was an absolutely extraordinary moment. I mean, there was an extraordinary moment, whether it's revolutionary or pre-revolutionary, as Zaid has just said, in Arab politics. But the dimension for people who are interested in constitutions is the extent to which an awful lot of the political upheaval was centered around questions of constitutional design, constitution writing, constitution drafting, and so on. And that's extraordinary. And it's extraordinary. Certainly in regional history, there had been constitutions, you know, littering the political history of the region for over a century. But this was a different moment. It was a different moment in that, you know, it was these efforts were taking place when regimes were either in real crisis, or feeling that they wanted to avert a real crisis, or they were actually gone, and it wasn't even quite clear who the rulers were. There was broad participation, and again, that's was fairly rare, at least in theory. I mean, there were elections, constituent assemblies that had some pluralistic participation. There was very, very broad public debate, and so there was some international support. In the past, these processes had tended to be under the radar screen internationally. And as I said, there was real political investment in these societies. It said, essentially, there's lots of things that have to happen, and a lot of those can happen through the constitutional process. So an extraordinary moment, okay. And now we're in 2021, and it doesn't look as if an awful lot of those hopes have been realized. So that's why we need a book. Now, Zaid has written that book, and let me tell you what I think his contributions are, and I'm going to mention three. The first he's actually kind of modest about, and that is what he said, well, I had to write the first part of the book. It was supposed to be just a chapter, but it kept getting bigger. That's a really important contribution where he goes through the various country studies. And the reason it's important is that this was not just that this was a complicated story, so we need somebody expert to kind of guide us through, but it was also an extremely contentious process. So if you got 5 people involved in, if you sat down 5 people involved in the process and said, what happened, you get 10 different stories, right? So Zaid actually guides us through a fairly dispassionate view, but also helping us understand what the process looked like from various points of view. So the first part of the book is not just a Wikipedia article saying here's what happened in the constitutions. It's going to stand the test of time, I think, as telling us this is the fundamental framework for understanding the processes in these countries. The second thing that he does that is subtle, and it came out in his remarks here, it comes out much more fully in the book, but it was implicit. So you take a look at older writings on constitutions, and they tended to focus an awful lot on precise legal language. How does the Constitution provide for this? How does the Constitution provide for that? And a lot of comparative constitutional analysis was like that. And it's unsurprising because it tended to be people with a constitutional law and a legal background who were writing this. So they went straight to text. And in more recent writings, now that the interest has broadened, often tends to focus on process. How is a constitution written? And what Zaid does in this book is essentially unite the two. So he walks us through the process and the resulting content, why certain constitutional choices were made, why certain provisions got in there, but not some sort of dry legalistic analysis, but a really intense political and sometimes even social analysis of what was going on. And the third contribution that he makes, I'm doing great in terms of time. I might even come in at 9 minutes. But the third contribution that he makes is that essentially showing how the devil is in the details. And this came out actually in his remarks right here when he's talking about, elections first or constitution first. This is kind of a false dichotomy. The spirit that animates that part of the book is to take platitudes, for instance, you need an inclusive process. You need consensus. You shouldn't move forward until most key actors are on board. International support should sort of cheer and assist and technically provide technical assistance for it, but it can't fundamentally instruct people on the politics of it. So you take sort of platitudinous statements like this, and they don't help you very much. They don't help you very much because they're too vague to be useful. And so what he does is show us in these particular cases exactly what inclusivity was intended to mean, how people used it, how people reacted to it, where mistakes were made, where places where the process, claimed to be based on a consensual approach, but didn't actually deliver it. The role for international support is extremely sophisticated. And again, this is, Zaid's strong suit because some of the international support was taking place in front of his eyes and sometimes through his own mouth and pen. But so this is something where we really see as I say, the devil in the details, where we move beyond kind of a very vague statements about what is good about constitutional design, and actually see the impact of specific choices in practice. And that brings us to my two final questions, and one actually has to do with choices. And he says at one point in the book, people had choices, and sometimes they made bad ones. And he just said in the remarks here, he was talking specifically about Egypt. People made mistakes, even pursuing their own interests. They did things they didn't have to do. And that's undeniably the case, right? But my question is that, in a sense, analytically interesting? And the reason I say that is, I remember hearing an Egyptian say, use a metaphor I'd never heard before, but he says, we have this expression in Egypt, and it's the only time I ever heard it, so I don't know if the expression exists very widely in Egypt, but it says, we're trying to fix the car while driving it. Okay, and that's there's an earlier metaphor that was used for the post 1989 transitions in Eastern Europe, rebuilding the ship at sea. So is that what's going on? In a sense, what you have is this overheated political period in which it's difficult to make sound calculations, right? You don't know. You don't quite understand what this process is. You don't understand who your friends are. Yesterday's ally might be tomorrow's adversary, and so on. So is this a situation in which we should really hold actors responsible for making mistakes? Isn't writing a constitution in this kind of context something that is going to be difficult and, in a sense, is inherently going to lead to miscalculations? Do we attribute the miscalculations, or do we attribute essentially the tumultuous environment? And my second question is actually sort of the flip side of that. So there's this moment, a wonderful anecdote he tells about the Libyan process and about some overview of the process. And he says he's sitting next to somebody who's been assigned to attend this discussion of the Libyan process, who has no background in it. He's a diplomat from another Arab state, so he's just supposed to be sitting there and reporting back on what's happening. But Zaid says he's just completely baffled by the entire discussion. And at the end, correct me, Zaid, if I get the anecdote wrong, he just says, "You people are completely crazy. This has no purchase in reality. This is a Bollywood film," he says. And meaning essentially that you're having this abstract discussion about the nature of elections in a country which is, in a sense, in the middle of civil war. There aren't going to be elections. It doesn't matter what you decide today. It's disconnected from reality. And I think my question for the book is, looking back on this after 10 years, I haven't seen enough Bollywood films to know whether or not that's an apt metaphor, but is this a process that was, we can tinker and say, if this was done differently, or if that was done differently, there would have been a different result. But is a tremendous investment of so much political hope in a moment of constitutional design really fundamentally misplaced? And in a sense, it wasn't bad. Could we argue it wasn't bad choices, but a fundamentally bad political situation in which you have a choice between essentially executive domination, what I would say where sovereignty in effect lies with a king or a president or a ruler of a chairman of a revolutionary command council or military high command, where you have sovereignty effectively lying in that person, and a set of mechanisms predicated on a false belief in popular sovereignty. Isn't this just a recipe that's going to lead to dashed hopes no matter what? That's a very pessimistic question. And it is a question because I want the answer to be no, but I don't know how the answer can be no, and so that's a question I'm sort of trying to lob back to Zaid. Can you give us some hope, some sense in which a better designed process, not tinkering here or there, but a better designed process would have led to a more positive outcome?
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Nathan. Excellent comments, and also for observing time. That is much appreciated from my perspective, certainly. So next we have Dr. Michelle Burgess-Castalla, who teaches here with me at the University of Edinburgh Law School. Michelle, over to you.
Thanks very much, Asanga. Well, thanks very much for giving me the chance to speak on this book and sort of reacquaint myself with some of the finer details of what's really happened in the last decade. I mean, I think it's a great moment to have this book out almost. You know, we have the the computer file version, and just to sort of reflect on the last decade, and do we read it in an optimistic way or a positive way? Which lessons can we take forward? I mean, I think the sort of enduring argument from the book from Zaid is very much that the revolutions have failed. They were never really revolutions. And I think this really, really powerful claim about continuity, not simply pre-2011 continuity, but actually a century of continuity. And that's what's really quite disturbing here, that we had such potential in 2011, such hope to dismantle decades of oppression. But yet what Zaid, I think, really forcefully brings out is actually how we have such deeply embedded repressive legal cultures that were precursors from the colonial period. And in many ways, we still in 2021 have those. And then the question is, well, to what extent are the constitutional texts themselves and this process that we saw over the last decade able to dislodge those deeply entrenched, really problematic legal cultures? So for me, when I was reading the book, I think my main interest was trying to tease out the relationship between the text and these textual practices and these processes that Nathan's just talked about, and then the sort of the broader political culture at play. So I'm just going to talk a little bit then as to what some of the themes that I thought were interesting in the book, and then talk a little bit about why things went wrong. And then I've got a few questions as well for Zaid. Thanks very much. So I think we can say very clearly that, you know, some of the key reasons as to why we got to 2011, and obviously Zaid tells us that it wasn't just 2011. We've had various moments of unrest, protest, opposition leading up to 2011. But the reason why we get to this really fundamental moment in 2011 is, as we've heard, a total breakdown in the social contract. So, you know, for some time we had attempts to sort of patch it up. And I think Zaid makes this lovely point that because of the structure of extreme authoritarianism, let's call it, the sort of state itself was unwieldy and was incapable of being flexible and adapting. And so when we get increasing, let's call them external shocks, particularly with the shrinking of the state, neoliberalism, the sort of the rejection of a broad social economic partnership with the people, the state just can no longer sustain any type of legitimate claim to providing the basic social goods, which it had supposedly done for some time, which were things like, as we've heard, bread, security, and some form of legitimacy. And sometimes we saw in the pre-2011 period, particularly earlier on in the mid-20th century, that legitimacy often came from outside. So that even if we had radical lack of representation internally, that some of the more radical sort of foreign policy initiatives that we saw in terms of, say, decolonization or the anti-Israel struggle or, you know, Arab unity, these broader projects in some way would sort of make up for legitimacy deficits internally. But I think by the time we get to the 21st century, those sort of broader legitimacy visions were lost. The state was radically truncated and weakened. And so we just have no social contract informed by internal or external legitimacy and validity, and just really, really pressing economic concerns. And obviously Zaid provides some startling statistics in terms of levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. At the same time, coupled with certain elites that, you know, he shows were able to maintain and sometimes actually increase their wealth, their position vis-a-vis the rest of the population. So we could not but have had something like what we saw in 2011. I mean, the conditions were just so pronounced. I mean, in many ways, it's surprising that it happened when it did and it didn't happen earlier. And there's been, you know, discussion as to the nature of the Arab state and how it's actually been able to maintain itself as such. But what's really fascinating then with the book is that, well, we've still got those conditions. This is what Zaid's really clearly telling us, that we still have largely the same elites holding on to power. We still have authoritarianism. We still have radical inequality, radical levels of poverty. So we have this sort of attempt to change all of this through these constitutional moments. These quite elaborate sometimes, or sometimes too short, processes of constitutional drafting. And so then Zaid provides a lot of detail through the various cases as to these processes. And what I really liked was how he just in a few pages unpacked the most important slogan of this period, "Ash-Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam," the people want the downfall of the regime. And I think I just wanted to unpack here a little bit the word nizam, the regime, because I think in some ways that gets to the heart of how we read the role of constitutions here. Because to me, I think when I was reading this book, I kept making a distinction between a constitutional text on the one hand and constitutionalism on the other hand. And I think when the people were calling for the fall of the regime, it was the fall of the entire order. It was the form of that mode of governance. It was the form of that non-constitutional type of experience of living under some type of state repression. And so I think then this sort of faith in the possibility of a constitution was actually about a faith in the possibility of living in a constitutional society, of having actually a proper social contract, of having some type of respectful and legitimate state society compact. And of course, we haven't seen that. But so for me, I kept thinking, okay, well, how could we have done this differently? And definitely, I mean, one thing that Zaid brings out is, okay, even if we've had some of these provisions changed and reworded, a lot of the time we still would have problems because they would just not be respected. So you give us some examples where they were just ignored, or or people didn't even know about them. So my question then kept coming back to, how can we change this? Because this is not about the text. I mean, Nathan was telling us that it's very important, the process of how this is written. And for sure, you've sort of elaborated on how, in fact, most of the people were never involved in this process. There was absolutely no widespread representation in terms of how the final draft came about. But if we then have even a beautiful draft, which we don't, but that draft then can be ignored or misinterpreted, as what does that mean for a constitutional order? Well, that isn't a constitutional order. And I mean, a lot of what you point to is the absolute failure of judicial independence, the lack of a sort of robust judicial culture that is divorced from patronage networks, executive control, fear, etc. So I mean, it really did seem that we just had this fundamental lack of a legal culture, very simply. And I was sort of trying to work out how that could have been changed. I mean, I wanted to ask you, if even if we have an imperfect text today, do you think if we somehow institute some really quite radical and different approach to legal education, because, for example, you said that the way generally law is taught in the region is highly didactic. It is actually quite anti to critical legal thinking skills. It's basically seen as serving the regime. Do you think if we started this process of a really different approach to legal education, that in itself in time would facilitate different, innovative, radical interpretations of the Constitution? I mean, and partly as well to then instill some type of consciousness beyond the legal elite, because I mean, part of what you're trying to hope for, I think, is empowered individuals who ultimately could actually bring claims before courts and could invoke their rights, because you're trying to think of a society whereby we do have this this legitimate relationship between state and society. And to do that, we need individuals who are actually aware of their rights in the Constitution and can enforce that. So that requires an educated general population, as well as a robust, critical, independent judiciary. So surely then education is absolutely vital here. So even if we've got a really imperfect text now, I mean, to what extent post facto could some type of ameliorative effort, which of course is massive in terms of resources required, to what extent, could that somehow change this really highly problematic legal culture that we have now? And just really my other question for you is, I think my favorite parts of the book were those little anecdotes at the beginning of the chapters. I think they were wonderful. They really took us straight into the negotiating room of one particular text. So I actually would have liked to have seen more of that. But as let's call it, a constitutional negotiator expert yourself now from the region, and in contrast to pre-2011, do you think that we can now identify a crystallized epistemic community of constitutional law or constitutionalist experts that we didn't have before 2011? And do you think that they do share some type of discourse and expertise that was not there before 2011? Because that in and of itself, I think, could actually be hugely important if we do enter, another moment of 2011. I mean, particularly given your highly critical stance in terms of non-Arab foreign forms of support. Could we draw on some sort of shared body of principles, language, frameworks that would be a resource for future initiatives? And can you just maybe tell us a little bit more about that? Because I'm aware myself of there was a lot of activity from various sort of think tanks over the last decade. So many reports have come out, but it's all been very disparate and fragmented. I mean, that's obviously your critique as well of UN initiatives, but as an individual partaking in these meetings, do we see something really quite rich emerging here in terms of an epistemic community? Thanks for that.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And once again, thanks for sticking to time very, very well. I know both your questions are things that Zaid has given his mind to for a very, very long time and being involved in many initiatives. So I'm looking forward to his response on both matters. Then next, our last discussant this afternoon, Professor Mohammed Fadel of Toronto.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me for this panel. And, first thing I want to just thank Zaid for all the work that he's done for us. And when I say us, I'm speaking as an Arab, as an Egyptian, because I really feel grateful for the personal sacrifices he's made over the last decade, because somebody's got to be doing this work. And I can't think of somebody better than Zaid to do it. And so my first point is I just want to make sure that I express my gratitude for that work, because it is heroic work in the face of tremendous odds and institutional opposition. And so this is sort of what I just want to sort of direct, I think, a few questions, I think, to Zaid that comes out of his work. And I'd just like to hear what he has to think about them. And I pose these questions largely from my perspective as a deeply interested insider, but also a scholarly outsider. And I'm trying to maintain my balance as a scholar who's supposed to maintain some kind of objectivity, while at the same time feeling deeply committed to the idea of Arab democracy in some sort of way, right? And so my questions sort of break down into two or maybe three broad categories. First, what's the role of normative political theory in trying to understand democratic transition in the Arab world? So on the one hand, I think one might say that looking at the experience of the two states that came closest to have something like a successful democratic transition, Egypt and Tunisia, from my perspective, it looked like there was this incredibly sincere commitment to formal constitutionalism that almost everybody, maybe with the exception of the Salafis, had some sort of genuine level of commitment to, different degrees, but there was a relatively shared commitment in the necessity of having a written constitution that would govern state and society, right? On the other hand, and I think this was sort of being alluded to earlier, it kind of seemed to be a discussion that was deeply unconcerned with popular concern about, daily quotidian issues, right? So there was lots of debate about how are we going to structure the government, presidential, parliamentary, semi-presidential, rights and freedoms, etc., political parties, elections, it's all those formal aspects of democracy. But it wasn't really clear that that motivated the median citizen. I remember having a discussion here in Canada with a group of Egyptians about the Ikhwan Constitution, right? The 2012 Constitution. And I remember one of my colleagues who was a professor of English at University of Ottawa, she's saying Egyptians don't care about political parties and elections. They want social justice, right? That they weren't interested in formal politics, right? And I thought that struck me as really, really weird. But maybe that's right. And maybe what happened in Tunisia is a reflection of that. And Zaid and I have talked about this idea that there's a perception of politics as something dirty and gross that you don't want to get involved in. And that what you want from the state are certain specific tangible goods. That's what politics is all about, right? It's not about creating coalitions, about creating political parties. Now, if that's the case, what is normative political theory teaching us, or is it totally misleading us about what democracy is all about? Are we going down the wrong path in trying to encourage formal democratic governance if somehow there's this disconnect between popular consciousness about what optimal governance is all about and the kinds of institutions that we think are required, if there's no real popular buy-in to it? And I think this is especially troublesome in the case of Tunisia, where there was a long time or it seems to be that there was sufficient time for political forces to organize themselves, but it didn't really materialize. So is there anything normative political theory has to teach us about democratic transition that we missed in 2011? Then what about empirical political theory? I mean, these are things that, troubled me at the time, continue to trouble me. For example, the demographics of Arab societies. What does it mean to do a democratic transition when over 50% of the population is under the age of 22, right? Democracy works in the long run, but youth are very impatient, understandably so. So there's, youth have very high discount rates. It's very hard to tell them you need to wait a generation or two for the investments that democracy will produce to benefit. Like, I don't care. I don't want to wait 80 years to see the benefits of good governance, right? I have a I have a bad life right now, right? Who is going to help me right now? Right? So how can you have democratic transition when half of the population is desperate right now for immediate solutions, right? Can democracy really deliver that? And then there's some global political economy issues that I think we need to worry about. Throughout the post-Cold War, the global supply chain was built out, that we're suffering from now. It broke down after COVID. But the reality is the Arab state system completely missed out on the development of the global supply chain. I read somewhere that the entire Arab world, in terms of its manufacturing exports, is less than the Philippines. So the entire Arab world has no economic basis to absorb its population, right? What can we do about that? We're not part of any global trading system, right? We're not part of the EU. We're not part of NAFTA. We're not part of a Pacific trading bloc. It's hard to imagine what kind of strategies governments can pursue in terms of economic development that would raise income and create the kind of resources that would allow them to make the social investments in human capital that presumably are a social precondition for effective democracy, right? So again, I'm curious, what does this tell us from the perspective of positive political theory? How can we confront this problem? Because, as you said, these already existed. What are we going to do? I mean, how can we confront them now? Another important lesson, maybe I should have said this when discussing the normative political theory point. One of the biggest objections that was raised to transition in Egypt was that the Ikhwan only had a majoritarian conception of democracy, right? Now, it just reminds me of what Abraham Lincoln said in the time of the Civil War. And he was like, look, the Southerners who are espousing essentially a version of minority rule, if you espouse this principle of minority rule, you're effectively arguing either for despotism or anarchy. And so the question I think that we still have to face fundamentally is, how do you have a constitution which is going to create the means for effective collective action, right? This is a precondition. So when people say isqat al-nizam, they don't mean they don't want a government that enforces property rights or doesn't protect them from criminal assaults, right? Or can't pursue economic development. What they want is they want to overthrow the illegal nizam. But the problem is, if you create an effective nizam, you also have the potential for a predatory one. So how do the constitutionalism essentially is how to strike the balance between effective collective governance and at least a minimum of individual freedom and dignity, right? And this is where I think is really depressing to me, at least speaking of Egypt. When you look at the 2014 constitution, it seems to be more about insulating the state from the people than making the state work for the people, right? And so that kind of tells us that there's been a consolidation, a de jure consolidation of anti-democratic forces in the Arab world, to the point that they are much more willing to collaborate with chauvinist Zionism than they are with their own people. And in such a context, is it conceivable that we can think of getting beyond this pre-revolutionary moment that you identify? I mean, what makes it possible that these objective conditions that call for the transformation, social transformation, can arise? Because, as you said, nothing's different. In fact, in many cases, it's worse, right? And so I don't see exactly why we should believe. I mean, I believe there's hope. I always believe there's hope, but I want to see the objective reasons to hope, right? Because if anything, domestically, things are much worse. Internationally, it's clear that the great powers are completely indifferent to democratic transition in the Arab world, right? So John Kerry says, well, it's not going to be a Jeffersonian democracy anyway. Wash his hands of it, right? And walk away. And so is there any sort of way, do we have a model for democratic transition where we have such bad political economic conditions and in different, if not hostile, international conditions, and a domestic economy that places almost all resources in the hands of the tyrants? I mean, it's a very bleak, I mean, pessimism of the mind, optimism of the will situation. And I'd like to be horribly corrected and explain to me why you are completely wrong. I mean, I hope I'm begging you to disabuse me of all my errors, Zaid. So I'll stop here.
Well, terrific. Thank you very much, Professor Fadel. And thank you to all three of our discussants for really thought-provoking questions to Zaid. Zaid, would you like to have an opportunity to sort of comment, respond, all of that, maybe 5 minutes or so before we open the floor for questions? And before I do that, to all the other participants, please feel free to come in and ask, put questions or your own observations to Zaid. The way to do that is through the reactions tab at the bottom. If you click on that one, then there's the raise the hand function. And then I will hand the floor over to you. But yes, soon after Zaid responds to the discussants, we begin with Adem.
Okay, cool. So I'll try to be as brief as I can, because there was at least 11 or 12 questions, so I may not be able to address them all in sufficient detail. So Nathan's, and first of all, thank you very, very much for those remarks. It was was extremely interesting for me to hear, and hopefully I'll have the opportunity to speak to you individually about everything that you said. In relation to Nathan's first point, he asks, is it analytically interesting that some actors made bad choices and perhaps acted against their own interest on occasion and so on and so forth? And that's tied to another question, which is, could things have ended up differently? And by and large, I think broadly speaking, I think that things may not have been able to end up differently in the region at the time. Different theories have been offered as to why that is, and some of you will have read Raudat Masood from the Kennedy School's writings about this, but he and I don't agree at all about the reasons. I mean, he thinks it's because of oil and religion, and I don't think that those things play as important a role as he does. But anyway, in my view, the reason why things may not have been able to end up in a different place is just because people were not ready, which it goes to what I was referring to before, which is that this was not a revolutionary moment. It was, even if it was, as Nathan describes, like an incredible political moment, one that'll mark our lives for the rest of our existence, but still it could not have been a revolutionary moment given what was going on in people's minds at the time and the structures that existed and so on and so forth. Having said that, there are different categories of actors, and I think there's also different categories of actions, and I think they need to be judged differently. So just to give you something like a really clear example of what it is I'm talking about, to just draw a very unfair comparison, but nevertheless one that's illustrative. There's a mountain of difference between Tunisia's interim authorities, who included basically, the former Speaker of Parliament and a retired former Prime Minister, and people who were way past it politically and had absolutely no understanding of transition, and were probably trying their best to do the best that they could back in 2011, but were basically making a fumbling mess out of it most of the time. And we could turn to that and say, well, they were trying their best, and there's nothing really they could have done differently, and that may be true, right? That's one category. Another category is, this international coalition that bombed Gaddafi's army to smithereens, right? Without which the revolution would have been crushed in no time. And instead of using that incredible amount of leeway and legitimacy as influence over national actors, which they could have used subtly, didn't need to take a grotesque form, they decided to take a step back and say, well, it's really up to the Libyans to do whatever it is that they want. And then afterwards, things just completely fall apart in a very obvious way. And, Daesh and ISIS emerging everywhere, and just like catastrophe all around. I wouldn't judge those two categories of actors according to the same standard, and I also wouldn't judge those actions of those different categories of actors as being the same level of mistake, if that's the word that we're using. Certainly there were a lot of people that were very unhappy with the international response in Libya after the end of the bombing campaign. I was amongst them. Some of my colleagues were included their objections, and many others did as well, right? Including people within those national governments who just thought it was a really crazy approach. And Libya was possibly the last place that should have been left to work things out on its own in the region. So I would draw that distinction, and what I would say is that even in those circumstances, these very imperfect and problematic circumstances where things could not, it was just a huge challenge to end up in a positive place. There were still, nevertheless, some actors who should have been in a position to do things differently, and they could easily have taken different decisions and proceeded with more tact, with a view to really providing genuine support, and which they did not. I mean, the SCAF is another actor. I mean, obviously they were, a bungling mess, but the sheer number of reversals, especially early on, was really unbelievable. I mean, even according to their own very poor standards, it was pretty shocking. So anyway, that's all I would say for now. But otherwise, in terms of your second question, Nathan, what I would say is that, I've already given some element of response, which is that in the circumstances, and I firmly believe this, that we were not in a revolutionary moment, so it could not have ended up in a different place. But is there a model that might have allowed for things to end up differently? So, it's really hard to say, but Sudan, provides some elements of a model. And the reason why that is, and I've already alluded to this, is because in Sudan, it was not a spontaneous uprising. It was calculated, it was structured. They had clear objectives. They negotiated their strategy and their objectives over a period of months, if not years. And then they decided to implement that strategy, in a very, very structured way, with a very specific objective in mind. It's an incredibly impressive operation. Now, very few countries have the capacity to organize like the Sudanese. They have this incredible social structure and sense of solidarity in that country, and this incredible history as well. So I don't know if we can draw comparisons with a place like, Iraq or other places. But it at least means that it's possible to achieve, at least in some circumstances. And in that type of circumstance, when you have an organized political force that has a clear objective, sadly in Sudan it didn't end up the way which we'd have liked, and we can talk about that afterwards if you'd like. But and part of the reasons were self-inflicted as well. But the manner of proceeding was really remarkable in comparison to other countries. And what I would say is that, a few of you have alluded to this, is that, I'm not an academic, right? So, I have written academic books or academic style books, but I'm not an academic. What I've written and what I've tried to do is try to provide material to people so that they can build or criticize or take apart what I've said and what I've offered, and build strategies of their own and visions of their own, right? And that's the purpose of the second chapter, the second part of the book. It's not supposed to be an academic deconstruction of what happened. It's supposed to be, my own vision of a roadmap or an objective of how things could be structured. And, to the extent that people can use that and other things that have appeared also in the past few years, and there are many, and have structured discussions about them in ways in which, the sort of way that people have done in other countries or any other parts of the world, then I think there is some hope, even if it's not something that we can cling to in the short term. And that leads to Michelle's first question. And I think a lot of the questions are coming from the same place, even if they're not specifically relating to the same issues. So on the issue of legal culture, so one of the reasons why this wasn't, or one of the ways in which the absence of a revolutionary moment manifested itself, was a clear lack of understanding of leaders in the uprising or leading political forces, a clear lack of understanding on their part of the role of courts in state and society. There was still this understanding, this vision in 2011 that there may be a few bad apples in the judiciary, but by and large, it's they're doing their job in the way that they should, which is totally wrong, right? I mean, judges, not all of them, but by and large, a lot of them consider themselves to be a government service, right? I mean, their job is to protect the state from the people, right? And people had an opportunity very early on to establish a vision as to how the courts should be reformed, and that was basically not really discussed at all. Instead, what ended up happening in the constitutional negotiations is that people just took the World Bank standards and for greater independence, and just figured that would be enough, and it ended up in many places making things worse, right? Because then it just means that in some cases you have a more democratic political system, but with less capacity to influence how the courts are structured, which in the short term is not a good thing, particularly given the legacy of the past 50 to 100 years. And that goes to the issue of legal education. And I'm totally in favor, and this is one of the strategies that we adopt. So we have short-term strategies and long-term strategies. And one of the things that we've done, or we have different ways of doing this, but we try to build up as many materials as possible for young scholars, be it doctoral students, master's degree students, postdoc, young academics, young lawyers to adopt critical thinking. One thing that we've done is that we've adopted or created a modern teaching curriculum for constitutional law that introduces critical legal thought for the first time in many law schools in the region, including in Iraq and Morocco and other places as well, in Tunisia too. We've created tons of materials for young people to develop a more critical understanding of the limitation of rights and so on and so forth. So yes, definitely, that's something that we feel very strongly about. It's hard to know how long it'll take for something like that to have an impact, and presumably it would take at least a few years, and we've been doing it for a few years already, so it might take longer than that. But yeah, definitely we feel very, very strongly about that. And then on the issue of whether or not the experiences of 2011 have changed things, the answer to that is definitely yes. I mean, in 2011, it was very easy to have conversations with really progressive people, people who are at the forefront of, sacrificing themselves in very violent protests, even though they, had 2 PhDs and so on and so forth, right? And then you would sit down with them and talk about their vision for what the state should look like, and they would say just really crazy things. They would just present really regressive visions. They don't do that anymore. Now they're completely on board now about how drastically things need to change. And in some cases, the change is very, very dramatic, and it's across the board. You can, from Morocco all the way to Iraq, the experiences that people have lived through have really changed their perspective. It's created a whole new generation of thinkers and activists and scholars and so forth that didn't really exist before. The scope of debate is much, much, much greater, even if in some countries it remains more or less the same. I think you know which ones we're talking about. And in relation to Mohammed's questions, and there's at least a few, and I don't know if I can address all of them. So Mohammed asks about the role of normative political theory, and if we're going down the wrong path, given that there may be a huge disconnect. So so I agree that for lots of people there's a disconnect. I agree with I've come across that same sort of attitude on many, many occasions. People have this distrust of political parties, which is partially a legacy, by the way, of the former regimes, that tried to encourage people to be apolitical, or didn't try to. They strongly encourage people to be apolitical and to be suspicious of political parties, and that sort of suspicion still exists in many countries, right? And that has an impact on people's capacity to organize and to form new political parties and new political movements in the ways in which we've seen in Tunisia, amongst other places, right? But I would add a couple of things there. So one is that one of the things that we would like to achieve, we've been trying to achieve, and will continue trying to achieve in the future, is to create or encourage this link in people's minds between the desire for social justice and the system of government, because you cannot achieve social justice unless you have a system of government that is designed to deliver social justice. And that's really the major challenge, or one of the major challenges, is to encourage people to really think deeply about the system of government and how it would need to be completely and radically redesigned, perhaps in ways that haven't been conceived anywhere yet, with a view to addressing this problem. And the illustration of how people completely miss that is that I think I described this in the book, is that the way in which people negotiated or drafted the sections on the system of government was basically just to tinker or a continuation of the previous system of government. So the previous system of government, as many people have said before, is basically a power sharing arrangement, even if it's lopsided in favor of the president or the king, but it's a power sharing arrangement between the different countries' different corporate interests. And when the system of government was up for renegotiation in all these countries in 2011 to 2014, the leading negotiators, including very progressive negotiators, would only focus on system of government as, or their only ambitions were to sort of like modify the power sharing arrangement, as opposed to looking at a system of government and just reconceptualizing it completely for the benefit of the individual, which is, in my view, and I've said this a couple of times already, it's just like was a terrible mistake. But to give you some hope, Mohammed, is that in Iraq recently, you may have heard this, there was an election not too long ago. And as you probably know, Iraq's political system is extremely violent and corrupt. And the controlling political parties have absolutely no hesitation to eliminate anyone who could potentially form any opposition. And maybe I'll stop after this because I can feel there's some discontent.
No, thanks, Zaid. I mean, I hate to stop you. All the questions were so fascinating, and so much of more detail coming out in your response and all the rest of it. But I would like, however, to also give the opportunity